Um, Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Powering Climate Action, Aligning SDG 7 with Nationally Determined Contributions. My name is Nina Pretorius, and I'm delighted to be your host for this important discussion. Today's event is part of the growing government engagement in energy access project funded by the UK Aid through the UK's government's Transforming Energy Access Programme. And this is co-organized by ClubER and the African Action Climate Partnership. We are thrilled to have you here to join us and explore the intersection of clean energy access and climate action, particularly through the lens of sustainable SDG 7 and the NDCs under the Paris Agreement. Over the next few 90 minutes, we'll hear from a range of experts and practitioners who will help us navigate the fundamentals of the Paris Agreement and NDCs and how SDG 7 can be effectively integrated into national climate strategies, real-world examples, including a case study from Kenya, and practical guidance on accessing climate finance to scale up clean energy solution. This the session promises to be a highly engaging and informative session. On behalf of the organizers, I'd like to thank you for joining us. And I encourage you to share your questions and reflections in the chat throughout the webinar. There will be questions and answers after each presenter. So with that, let's begin with our first presentation, which will be presented by Minky Groenewald who will be covering the indices and Paris agreements. Minky, with any further ado, you may enlighten us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Greetings from Kampala. I'm Minky Groenewald from the UNFCCC Regional Collaboration Center for East and Southern Africa, based in Kampala. Next slide, please. So part of our work revolves around supporting 19 countries in the East and Southern African region. And it revolves around key thematic areas shown in the next slide, involving NDC, LTLEDs, Article 6. Next slide, please. Article 6 for parties and non-party stakeholders. Next slide, please. Yes. So ours is to assist countries in accelerating ambition and implementation of their NDCs and LTLEDs. And specifically, my thematic area that I'm working on is the NDCs and the LTLEDs. Thank you, South North, for inviting me to this very important conversation, which is quite timely, as we all know that this year, 2025, is quite a pivotal year for global climate action. We see the high expectations from most countries to actually submit their next round of NDCs, and the cycle for ratcheting up commitments has actually come to an end. So with the 2025, we are hoping that countries will submit more ambitious, progressive, and investable NDCs based on the global stocktake outcomes that happened in 2023. So I will be covering just an overview of the Paris Agreement, the processes, and where we are now in terms of implementation and what opportunities exist in ensuring that we synergize the implementation framework for these two post-2015 frameworks, and assist countries in ensuring that they continue to raise ambition, drive economic transformation, and empower local communities. Next slide, please. So this year marks the 10 years of climate ambition, and building on the foundation that was set by the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that was adopted in 1992 with its sister conventions, the UNCBD and UNCCD. We see the objectives of that convention being embodied through the Paris Agreement, which seeks to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions and to ensure that we adapt and ensure that we support sustainable development. So, through the years, the complexities around how this was going to be structured has quite been a process for countries. As early as 1992 with the UNFCCC, which didn't set specific targets, the Kyoto Protocol came in 1997, trying to set a structured way for countries using a top-down approach where legally binding targets ranging from 8 to 10% were proposed. However, following disagreements from some countries at the end of the 2012 commitment periods, countries suggested that there was a need for a more bottom-up approach where countries would have to decide for themselves. Hence, the nationally determined contributions model. So as early as 2007, through the Bali Action Plan, we see countries coming up with the NAMAs, which are nationally appropriate mitigation actions. But what that sets up is that countries realize that it's not only developed countries who have a role to play, but everyone has a part to play. So the negotiations continue through Copenhagen, Cancun, and Durban. And in 2011, parties actually come together and develop a new legal instrument applicable to all countries. And this now led to the intended nationally determined contribution, which was first introduced in COP19 in Warsaw. So by COP20 in Lima, the idea of the nationally determined contribution matures, and countries are invited to submit INDC, intended nationally determined contribution, before 2015 as a way to a step forward from previous efforts, and to not only include mitigation actions, but also adaptation actions and support needs. But flexibility or around LDCs and NCs was also noted for that process. So we see now in 2015 countries agreeing on the Paris Agreement. And though while countries were developing their first INDC, there wasn't a structured way. A lot was yet to be discussed. So when you look at the first round of the NDC, it wasn't as structured as the subsequent NDC submissions. So, but in essence, what the NDC shows is that there is the concept surrounding the common but differentiated capabilities and responsibilities, which means countries get to decide for themselves what is important to them, what they can be able to achieve, what is conditional and unconditional. Next slide, please. So the nationally determined contributions are the foundation of the Paris Agreement, which sets three main goals in Article 2 on limiting warming to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to 1.5 degree, and enhancing adaptation, climate resilience, and ensuring that all action is aligned with financial flows and so forth. So the NDC is a primary tool for achieving these goals also sets up a mechanism where countries prepare and communicate through a whole of society or government approach, where everyone is included at national level, and then this is now submitted to the UNFCCC, and then the expectation is that there should be no backsliding. So each NDC is expected to be successive, meaning represent progression from the previous one, and then all parties are actually supposed to also provide information that will provide clarity, transparency, and understanding on the process that they undertook, the methodologies, and so forth when they were developing their NDCs. And there's a cycle that revolves around the NDCs. Next slide. Next slide. Uh, to mention the LTLEDs in Article 4.19, we see countries being encouraged now to also formulate long-term low emission development strategies, which are also for long-term planning, but provide the long-term context for the NDC, whereas NDC are more of short to medium-term climate commitments. But now the ambition cycle, which actually has completed, we are seeing the completion of it this year, is part of the tracking of the progress and informing the next step in the development of the new NDCs. So the Paris Agreement establishes this cycle of planning, implementation, and review for NDCs, where countries they develop and plan, they monitor at national level, and then through the enhanced transparency framework articulated in Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, countries actually report on the implementation to the UNFCCC for an international review process. And following that, then there is the global stock take under Article 14, which actually now informs the next round of the NDC. So together with Article 4 on the provisions of the Paris Agreement, together with Article 4 on the NDCs, Article 13 on the Enhanced Transparency Framework, and Article 14 on the global stocktake, these interlinkages form the driving force behind informing ambition and in effective climate efforts. Next slide, please. So generally, when we're looking at the key trends surrounding the energy sector in the NDC, we recognize that out of 168 latest available NDCs, actually 99% of them mention energy as a key priority. So we see countries prioritizing cost-effective energy mitigation options, particularly those that cost less than 20 US dollars per ton of CO2 equivalent. And the key energy related options include solar energy, where 51% of the parties communicated that, wind energy at 36%, and more importantly, industrial energy efficiency. So these measures not only offer significant emission reductions, but they are also economically viable, scalable, making them central to long-term energy transition strategies. Next slide, please. On the other hand, with the LTLEDs, which are voluntary under the Paris Agreement, so out of this many countries, we have around 68 LTLEDs that have been submitted by countries as of 2023. So we also see that around 99% of countries have plans around increasing renewable energy in electricity systems, grid strengthening, energy storage expansion, and cross-sector integration. So we also see the introduction of also on long-term infrastructure planning and these strategies again also reflect this comprehensive and coordinated approach for long-term climate action, emphasizing both technological transformation and inclusive development by countries. Next, please. Yeah. So now the outcomes of the global stocktake, which is the key feedback mechanism under the Paris Agreement that assesses the collective progress towards achieving its long-term goals. So the first global stocktake, which was concluded in COP 2028 and 2023, serves as the critical input for the next round of NDC, and it's designed as a way for us to reflect as countries on where we are, and also to inform and inspire the next round of national planning moving forward. So the mitigation section of the GST1 makes it clear that while there has been some significant collective progress towards the Paris Agreement, we are still not on track to meet the Paris Agreement temperature goals. So this is also in line with the latest research by the IPCC in the sixth IPCC report, and the global stocktake also reiterates this information from the IPCC findings, showing that to limit warming to 1.5 degree requires emissions must fall by 43% by 2030, 60% by 2035 relative to 2019 levels. And yet, if the current NDCs are fully implemented, emissions would only fall by 2% by 2030. So this is a stark gap that demands urgent action. And with the SDG 7 being closely linked with mitigation for the NDC, it provides quite an opportune moment for countries to provide those linkages and expand. So the global stocktake outcomes also encourage countries to, in a nationally determined manner, of course, to actually continue to come up with economy-wide targets, and specifically on scaling up renewable energy and energy efficiency by 2030. If you are aware of the latest report by IRENA in July, which still says that we are still under, we still need to do more. So there's need to also phase out inefficient for fossil fuel subsidies and transition away from unabated coal, and even broader efforts around uh, lifestyles and ocean-based mitigation. So though the call varies in terms of timeline, some are by 2030, some by mid-century, which is up to the country to decide. But this decade is very, very critical for action. So the next round now of the NDC, as articulated by the global stocktake, the what has been informed for this year's process is that countries have to make sure that their NDCs are more ambitious and have economy-wide emission reduction targets, meaning that they cover all sectors. And what is important also is that we don't want action plans that will remain action plans. We want a new round of NTCs that will be implementable, investable, and more inclusive, and speaks to the realities on the ground. With Africa facing so many challenges on energy access, it's quite critical that we treat mitigation in the NTCs not only as a climate change, climate action issue, but as a development imperative. So the paragraph 164 of the GST also talks about how this year we have to submit. The deadline was February 2025, but it was extended. So for Africa, we have four right now, 4 countries that have submitted, Kenya and Somalia and Zambia and have submitted their country statements, so are expecting fully elaborated NDC also from them. And then now from the 2030 or 2025 targets, we want an end date of 2035. So, but it still notes the capacity challenges of the groupings around LDCs and the seeds. So in terms of content, is that we want the highest ambition possible from countries, and the information surrounding the NTC development and all should be very, very clear. And the importance also of ensuring that this round of NDCs is aligned with the long-term strategies is very, very important, so that we move from just short-term planning but to long-term planning. Next slide, please. So generally, this will require also an enabling environment at country level regarding policy formulation, ensuring that the NTCs have an implementation plan. We are seeing a growing trend also in Africa, where most countries are now also developing investment plans, and now they have climate finance units. So the issue around financing is very, very important. And luckily for this year, also the climate weeks are actually centered around driving ambition, and a lot of countries will be coming together and speaking about how they will develop a bankable and investable NDCs. With that, I will leave it here, and thank you so much, Nina.
Thank you, Minky, so much for that informative presentation. Yeah, we definitely do need to be moving on to how to find things to become more bankable with climate finance as well. And how can countries be moving more forward with long-term goals instead of short-term goals and achieving it, because it is for the long run after all. And we need to just keep our questions at the end of the webinar. So we can just move on to our next speaker, Esther. If you are ready, we'd like to move on to our next presentation, and Esther will be sharing some country experience in Kenya on what they are doing at the moment on the implementation. Esther Wangombi. And see your screen.
It's gone, eh?
It's on, yes. You can just put it in presenter mode, please, Esther.
Okay, yes.
Should we share, Esther?
Just share it from your end. I think I am having an issue from my end. Please.
Okay,
thank
great.
you.
Good.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those who are in the morning part of the day. My name is Esther Wangombe. Hope I am audible. Nina, can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible, Esther. We can hear you clearly.
So I work in the State Department for Energy, that is Ministry of Energy and Petroleum here in Kenya. Next, please. Just a brief introduction. In Kenya, much as we don't emit much compared to other developed countries, we are heavily impacted by issues of climate change because our economy relies heavily on natural resources, which are susceptible to impacts of climate change. And our country has a devolved two-tier government, which consists of one, the national government, and apart from the national government, now we have 47 county governments, and all these have got defined spheres of power and functions. For example, the national government is the one responsible for formulating policies that ensure that our country transforms into a low carbon climate resilient development pathway. And the national government also designs programs and the projects which are implemented by the county governments, the 47 county governments. Continue. Next slide. Climate change governance in our country is, we have several legal frameworks that fall under these governance. For example, we have the Climate Change Act of 2016. This is the act that actually guides our nation's response to climate change in both governments, the national government and the county government level. And through this Climate Change Act, we have developed other climate change action plans. For example, the National Climate Change Action Plan, National Adaptation Plan, even our NDCs, they are all anchored on this particular Climate Change Act. And this act was amended in 2023 so that it could accommodate a legal framework for carbon regulation so that we also fit within the carbon markets. Then another legal framework that we have is the NDC. And the first, we had the updated NDC. Okay, before we go to the updated one, the first NDC we submitted in 2020, and it was in line with the Paris Agreement. And in this particular NDC, Kenya had pledged, we tried to be a little bit ambitious. We had said we would be reducing our emissions by 32% relative to the business as usual scenario. And we had said we would meet this target by year 2030. I continue. Next slide. Let me zero in on the new NDC. That is the most recent one. We call it the second NDC, though some people refer to it as the third because there was the first one. Then we updated the first one, and then now we have this second NDC, which is supposed to be implemented from 1st January 2031 to 31st December 2035. And this particular one was built on existing national policies and legal frameworks. For example, it referred a lot to our Kenyan constitution. It referred to the Climate Change Act of 2016, and also Kenya's long-term low emission development strategy, among other legal frameworks. And the main focus of this new NDC is on green energy transition, hoping that we hope that this will ensure that Kenya's economy thrives in harmony with environmental sustainability. Another legal framework that we have is the National Climate Change Action Plan. And actually, this is the document that we use to mainstream and implement the climate change actions as outlined in our NDC. Continue. Next. We also have, these are the legal framework, the National Long-Term Low Emission Development Strategy, and our LTS assesses we assess the country's emission reduction potential And we also estimated the level of investments needed to achieve the same. The same LTS outlines key targets and actions that we need to implement to deliver the objectives of that strategy. And as I said, it is aligned to our national climate change action plans and our country development goals, among other development agendas. It is actually, I can say it is one of the documents that has a long-term strategy on how to cope with climate change impacts in Kenya. Next. Let me zero in onto the role of our State Department for Energy as far as the implementation of SDG 7, NDC, LTS, Climate Change Act, among other legal frameworks that discuss climate change is concerned. The SDG number 7 focuses on ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. And basically, this is what we do under the Renewable Energy Directorate. And the SDG's goal is it also emphasizing increasing the share of renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, and enhancing international cooperation for clean energy research. So within our State Department for Energy, our directorate actually focuses a lot on this achieving what this SDG has outlined. Our State Department focus on the renewable energy development is very, very key. For example, approximately 90% of our electricity in the grid is supplied from Kenya's renewable energy sources. This renewable energy is from geothermal. Actually, geothermal energy is the leading source of renewable energy in the country. And the next following is hydropower. We also have wind power. And we are proud as Kenya to host the largest wind farm on the African continent. Next slide. Now, talking about energy access in Kenya, in the year before the year 2014, our access levels were very, very low. For example, by around 2014, we were at 30% access level in the country. But that jumped to around 75% by last year, that is by 2024. And we are looking forward to increasing the same to 100% access by year 2030. Our urban areas are, I can say, they have access to electricity, whether it is off-grid or from the grid. And then we have an extensive transmission network, which includes our regional interconnectors that support our cross-border electricity trade. For example, we have a regional interconnection with our neighboring countries, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and also Uganda. We also have a program which we call the Last Mile Connectivity, which was launched in the year 2015. This particular project has really enhanced our access. Very many people have been reached by the grid through this particular project. And this project has reduced the number of people without access to electricity by nearly half in just under 10-year period. We also have what we call the off-grid solar solutions, the solar home systems. And actually, off-grid solutions are the best in our remote areas of this country, because we have areas where the grid is very, very far, but the off-grid solutions, including mini-grids, hybrid solar systems, among others, they actually serve the underserved communities in most of our remote areas. And these off-grid solutions, they have become a key part of Kenya's electrification strategy. We have also been promoting energy efficiency, and we are hoping to double the energy efficiency in the industry, in the homes. We hope to double it and double our efforts by year 2030. Next slide, please. Of course, as a country, we have been facing very many challenges. It is not all rosy. For example, we have several critical challenges that have been plaguing us here and there. For example, about 25% of our Kenyan population still do not have access to electricity, with our rural areas having the lowest access. And even as we are trying to target to have access, energy access to all Kenyans, of course, the population is growing. As the population grows, you see our target now has to keep changing. If we are targeting to reach 5 million Kenyans, you find that by the time we are reaching that number, more Kenyans are born. Some have grown up. They have moved from their homesteads to other homesteads. So more and more electricity is needed to connect them. Then, of course, Kenya has, we say we have significantly improved in access to clean cooking solutions over the past decade. For example, in 2013, the access rate for clean cooking was around 10%, but by 2023, it was over 30%. But despite this progress, we have millions of Kenyans who still use firewood for cooking, charcoal, and kerosene for cooking. So we are still a long way to go to achieve our access to clean cooking. And then we also have other challenges pertaining to our power distribution, where we face very high losses, which by 2023, the losses were estimated at 23%. That is losses from the grid. And these occur due to technical issues. Sometimes we have losses of our power due to theft. There are some people who are able to connect themselves without authority of our Kenya Power and Lighting Company. And of course, once they do that, especially in the slum areas, they don't pay for that power. And sometimes it's not so easy to detect them. And then, of course, we have issues of the bidding problems, sometimes errors in the bidding, so we incur losses through that. Then our major challenge is finances. We have very little climate finances that flows in Kenya. And therefore, we are still short of funding to achieve our NDC. Next slide. As a State Department for Energy, we have our future plans. Among the many, I just highlighted 4 of them. We are planning to rehabilitate and expand our power generation, transmission, and distribution capacity at competitive costs, because also sometimes it can be very expensive to expand our power generation, transmission. So we are hoping we will do it in a very competitive manner so that we can attract investors. We also hope to increase the share of renewable energy in the energy mix because we would want to leverage on the abundant renewable energy sources that our country has. And this will help us to enhance energy security and at the same time achieve the national climate goals. that are there in the various legal frameworks in the country. We are also hoping to mobilize funding for energy projects from both public and private sources, using various means to mobilize the same. We are also looking forward to increasing regional integration with our neighboring countries. Next slide, please. In conclusion, I can say that our energy sector supports the SDG 7 by promoting affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. And this energy is actually renewable energy. And we are also well positioned to meet the long-term energy and development goals, including the climate change goals, the climate change strategies, the NDCs. We are well positioned to actually meet the objectives of those legal frameworks. We have strong policy frameworks. We also have skilled workforce in the country. Actually, some of our people, they go to other countries to work. Some, maybe Nina is a witness, some have come to South Africa, others have gone to other countries, simply because we do have a high-skilled workforce in the country. We also have a high renewable energy potential in our country. And the country is paving the way toward a more inclusive, sustainable, and secure energy future. So I would say that we are trying our best to meet to meet the SDG number 7, our LTS, our NDCs, our Climate Change Act. Our only challenge, as I said, is the funding. And with that, I say asanteni and thank you.
Thank you, Esther, Sante. Thank you once again for taking us through a country's perspective and sharing the insights and experiences from Kenya's journey of integrating the SDG 7 into your climate strategies. For those who have questions, please still hold on to your questions. We'll be having the question session at the end of the webinar, towards the end of the webinar. Next up, we'll hear from Amy Trudeau, who will share insights on climate finance and how it can enable countries to accelerate climate action and expand energy access. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nina, for that way of introduction. And thank you, colleagues, for the incredible, very informative presentation so far. Nina, can I just ask you, is it possible for me to share my slides from my side?
Yes, it is. You have the, yeah.
Let me go ahead. Okay, can you see my slides and can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible and it's visible.
All right, great. So thank you very much. And again, thank you, colleagues, for the really great discussion and presentation so far. I'm really looking forward to hopefully having something of a discussion at the end. And I think that this presentation actually moves logically quite nicely along now. We're going to be presenting on issues of climate finance as a catalyst for climate action. My name is Amy Trudeau. I'm a project manager and research assistant at South North, which is, probably quite familiar with. It's a climate change NPO in Cape Town. And my areas of work is very much based in the climate finance stream, where I've worked on research on Article 21C, operationalizing that in Africa, financing the just energy transition in Africa, questions of loss and damage financing, a little bit of work on the NCQG, and more recently having a look at the sort of link between increased trade on the continent and financing of NDCs. All right, so keen to jump right in. So the crucial issue about climate finance is that without well-structured, adequate climate finance, NDCs and climate ambitions and goals can only remain on paper. And so climate finance is really at the core of the conversation here and very essential for implementation, which for me is why it's become such a passion. So I'm going to explore and unpack a little bit how climate finance, through looking at both traditional and innovative sources, can support countries in implementing climate action and really looking at bridging the climate finance gap that exists currently. And I'm going to be sort of looking within the broader African context, which is where most of my work is situated. So before diving into sort of the more specific and technical details of climate finance and how it can support NDCs, I always like to start, and I think it's important to start by signposting Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which is sometimes referred to as the finance goal, but essentially it's the third long-term goal of the Paris Agreement, which sets out and indicates that all financial flows must be aligned with low emissions and climate resilient development. And this is including both global and domestic finance flows. Operationalizing Article 2.1c, which is essentially the overarching global framework on climate finance, means that countries' NDCs must be linked to clear, demonstrable, and also implementable investment plans. So in other words, climate-aligned finance is really not optional. It's absolutely central to delivering credible climate action. However, the problem that we're facing, and we're facing particularly strongly in Africa, is that there's really insufficient climate finance available currently. And the gap between what is currently flowing and what is required for implementing climate goals the gap is really massive. Just for example, developing countries will need between 5.9 and $6.8 trillion by 2030. And for Africa alone, just the energy sector requires around $240 billion per year, of which 180 billion must be going to clean energy. However, despite these needs, Africa is currently receiving only 3.3% of global climate finance flows, which is showing you, really emphasizing how massive that gap is. And only around 23% of the investment needs for Africa's NDCs are currently being met. To stay on track, finance flows to Africa would need to roughly quadruple every year through 2030. This shortfall is particularly severe when it comes to issues of adaptation versus mitigation, and also is particularly severe in meeting the needs of poorest and most climate vulnerable countries. All right. So this climate finance gap matters not only for issues of climate action, but it's also really important for development, as these two issues are so deeply intertwined on the continent, which I think we heard a little bit about from Esther there. So 600 million Africans, which is about 40% of the population, are lacking access to electricity, and around 70% currently lack access to clean cooking facilities, just really underlining again sort of how much still needs to be done. However, achieving universal energy access and addressing this energy and electricity demand has to be done in a low carbon way if NDCs are not going to be compromised on. For me, climate finance comes really strongly in here, as although current finance flows are really far from adequate in tackling these intertwined issues of energy development and climate in Africa, aligning financial flows with expanded clean energy access would present a double win for the continent, right? Which, as it would drive development while also lowering emissions, feeding into both the achievement of SDG 7 and the pursuit of NDC targets. Okay, so having unpacked and discussed the need and context of climate finance and sort of, the relation to NDCs and SDG 7 before sort of taking a technical dive into financing mechanisms, it's really important to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we talk about climate finance? Or what does it mean to say climate finance? So currently, there's no single agreed definition as to what climate finance is exactly, but the lessons from developments in the international sort of climate finance space, such as, for example, the $100 billion goal, the NCQG, I think that the lessons are really quite clear. And those are that climate finance absolutely should not create debt burdens for vulnerable countries through market rate loans or heavy conditionalities attached. And for adaptation in particular, grants are actually the most appropriate and relevant form of finance, and that the focus should rather be on concessionality rather than loans. So at the current moment, a lot of the proportion of climate finance that is flowing to developing countries is actually more in terms of loans rather than in grants, and it's not always concessional finance. So this is quite a big problem that needs to be solved. Climate finance, also not just about the volume of finance, is also a really important qualitative element that needs to be considered. So taking into consideration issues of accessibility, alignment with national priorities, and effective deployment are equally important. Ultimately, and this is one of my points that I think about quite often, is that we need to move away from input-based to outcome-based finance, thereby ensuring that what is provided financially is actually meeting the scale of ambition and the needs of developing countries. So what this kind of means is that essentially climate finance flows should be determined by the actual real needs of developing countries and not sort of worked out backwards from the available or already flowing existing finance or what countries, particularly developed countries, are willing to pledge. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to unpack some financing mechanisms for closing the financing gap. So when we talk about closing the climate finance gap, it isn't just one tool or one sort of silver bullet that's going to solve this problem. Rather, there's a toolbox at our disposal with a wide range of mechanisms that are available, from things like blended finance and guarantees to taxes and levies, and to some quite interesting innovative mechanisms like climate resilient debt pause clauses, which to me I find quite interesting and very pertinent at the moment. So the idea is that these instruments can actually work together to mobilize finance at scale largely by crowding in investment from the private sector, and reducing risks for private investors, right? And this can be done by creating predictable public revenue streams and by supporting the development of bankable projects. And this becomes really important because due to the scale of money required to finance climate action, private sector involvement in financing is absolutely critical, as the money simply does not exist at the moment in the public sector. So today I'm going to just zoom in on 3 financing mechanisms and do like a little bit of a deep dive into them. Not to say that the others are not relevant, but I think that these ones are particularly relevant to our conversation today around energy and Africa. So going to first unpack blended finance, and then a little bit into carbon markets, and then finally investments in off-grid and smart grid systems. So first, when it comes to blended finance, what we mean is this is essentially combining concessional public funds with private capital to reduce risk and unlock larger investment flows. It's quite nice to illustrate with an example. So we can look at the EEP Africa program, which is backed by Nordic donors, and that has used about 50 million euros of donor funds to catalyze over 200 private-led solar and clean energy access projects. When we talk about blended finance, multilateral development banks also have a really crucial role to play here, as they often are the ones, or some of the ones, providing concessional loans, guarantees, and also technical support that makes projects bankable. And historically and currently, they've been key backers of renewable energy auctions, green bonds, and blended finance facilities in Africa. At the same time, there's also quite a strong call, an indication of a need for multilateral development bank reform, in that they need to make their finance larger, sort of faster, reduce those hurdles to accessing finance, and also more accessible, just to scale up the amount of blended finance that they are actually supporting. The broader point about this particular instrument and the instruments such as concessional loans, guarantees, or green bonds is that they can transform marginal projects into more bankable ones, drawing in commercial investors, which I sort of mentioned why that is so important. With a $2 trillion annual financing gap for the SDGs and climate, leveraging very scarce public funds and absolutely maximizing and optimizing them through blending is really quite essential. Another important mechanism, which has been quite a buzzy concept in a few years and has had some controversy, it would be great if we could get to a conversation about it later, is this issue of carbon markets. So under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and as was sort of formalized at the COP29, carbon trading can provide new revenue streams for African mitigation projects, including particularly renewables and forestry. It's quite popular for that. However, the issue here is that integrity is absolutely key, and credits must reflect real emission reductions. Host countries need to receive a fair share of the benefits. The thinking is that if carbon markets are well designed, they could finance emission cuts and enable technology transfer, but also directly funding NDC priorities. There's quite a nice example in Nigeria, which through the country's carbon market activation policy, the country aims to generate $2.5 billion in credits by 2030. And they have actually already launched a national registry under the African Carbon Markets Initiative, also known as the ACMI. So the third mechanism is something of a newer concept to me personally, but it's very interesting and very highly relevant, and it's this discussion around off-grid and smart grid investments. So off-grid solar systems and mini grids can provide clean electricity in rural areas while replacing costly and oftentimes polluting diesel use, for example, coming from diesel-based generators. In Rwanda, for instance, to look at an example, the Renewable Energy Fund created local currency credit lines for banks, enabling private loans to solar entrepreneurs. Similar donor-backed funds have supported mini grids and last-mile solar access in Nigeria, Uganda, and elsewhere. And these often target women-led businesses, which show that how co-benefits can come in with this particular mechanism. At the same time, questions of upgrading grids through implementing smart meters and loss reduction measures is also really essential to integrate renewables at scale. And these investments usually are typically supported by concessional finance. So having unpacked some of these mechanisms, interesting to look at how some of these mechanisms are already being applied in a bit more detail in some countries. In South Africa, for example, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, commonly referred to as REI4P, thank goodness, because that's quite a mouthful, is a competitive tender process which has attracted more than $16 billion in private investment between 2011 and 2020 and ended up adding over 5 gigawatts of renewable capacity. This public-private program helped bring down renewable tariffs while also advancing NDC targets through the scaling up of renewable energy in the country. South Africa has also pioneered some interesting municipal green bonds. Cape Town's bonds, for example, have financed adaptation projects like cedar fences and housing relocations. In Nigeria, their energy transition plan will require $410 billion in investment across power, transport, and industry. So to support this, what Nigeria is actually doing is creating a blended climate investment fund in order to channel public and private capital into things like mini grids, electric mobility or e-mobility, and green industries. Also, through its Mission 300, Nigeria and its partners aim to bring electricity to 300 million Africans by 2030. This initiative is African Development Bank and World Bank backed and is an instance of aligning energy access goals with issues of climate finance. Right. However, having packed and discussed and had a deep dive into some of these sexy, climate finance mechanisms, mobilizing finance it's not really just about the instruments. There are real systemic challenges that need to be considered and addressed when going about addressing and trying to close the climate finance gap. So firstly, countries need to better align their NDC goals with national budgets and their development plans. So going for something of more of a policy kind of coherence, while also ensuring that finance pipelines are integrated in with NDC cycles. Mobilizing private capital also requires reducing perceived risks through tools like guarantees, currency hedges, and insurance, while also deepening local capital markets. So that's kind of referring back to that blended finance question. Stronger institutions are also desperately needed, particularly in finance ministries and line agencies, in order to prepare, to support project preparation, really, to track results and to better manage transactions. Finally, regional collaboration is also quite important, where cross-border projects like regional power grids can pool resources and actually build scale. So to conclude, the climate finance deficit in Africa, globally, but particularly in Africa, it's immense. It's very, very big, and it is really needing to be addressed and to be closing that gap. And really, the key takeaway from this presentation of mine is that there are options available, targeted solutions that exist, and many are already running on the ground quite successfully. So scaling up mechanisms like blended finance, leveraging carbon markets that are of high integrity, and investing in off-grid and smart grid systems are all ways to close the gap. Expanding clean energy access is not only critical for development, it is also really essential for meeting NDCs. Then we must turn to our policymakers, who must create enabling environments with stable policies and clear frameworks, and who must actively engage the private sector as partners as a matter of high urgency. Overall, my message is clear, which is that we need to align NDC ambitions with finance roadmaps, strengthen institutions, and mobilize all the financing instruments, the appropriate financing instruments available to us in order to turn climate commitments into reality and to get them implemented by closing the climate finance gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for that insightful presentation and sharing such valuable perspectives. You gave us a lot to reflect on. But as we continue for today's discussion, the floor is open for questions for the previous presentations that were given. So if you do have any questions, you can raise your hand and unmute and ask. Usman has a question. You can go ahead, Usman.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for organizing this webinar. It's really impactful. And so just to go to the point, my question is to the last speaker from Kenya, before the Kenya's presentation. How many countries in Africa have submitted their 3.0 NDCs? And for example, has Nigeria been able to, because I know there were issues with other ministries to get some data, but has Nigeria been able to submit NDC 3.0? Thank you.
Thank you, Usman, for your question. But unfortunately, Minky had to drop off. However, I will share your question with her so she can respond to it with our post communications that will be shared, and she can answer. You will find the answer in there. If you do have another question, you may ask for Esther and Amy in the meantime.
So for Amy, what I can, my question is basically on bridging the financing gap. We all know that African governments, some of them have the means to cater for renewable energy financing, be it from their raw materials. They can convert those raw materials to support energy access and also achieving the SDGs in general. But I think sometimes the political will and also some level of government inefficiency to some extent, how can UNFCCC through the GCF and JEF and other global funding financing institutions come together to enhance capacity of those institutions across Africa, not only the finance, but building the capacity of these institutions to be able to understand what it takes from within to galvanize resources from within, not coming from the global north. I think that will make a lot of sense. Is there any way we can have an avenue whereby these institutions are being developed in terms of capacity to harness the potentials they have locally in order to achieve these SDGs before the 2030? Or even, let's say, SDG 7, universal access to energy for all. If that could be achieved, I think many of the SDGs could be achieved. So is there any way these global financial institutions and UNFCCC and other United Nations framework can have that momentum to say, okay, we are going to put our resources to help you realize the potentials you have in your countries so that you can be able to achieve this without relying so much on the global north. Thank you. Because the resources are there and the potentials are there. But the only need is to how do we convert these potentials into the resources needed to achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your really interesting and great question. I'm going to do my best to engage and answer with it, but maybe I'll also be keen to hear from you, sort of your own thoughts. So I think it's really interesting because, of course, under the Paris Agreement, national governments are essentially the custodians. They're the custodians of the Paris Agreement and of climate commitments. But the problem does come in, as you're pointing out, where the issues of it can be political will, as you're saying, but sometimes it really is a capacity issue because, of course, African countries have such severe competing development priorities, right? So I think it is absolutely essential and critical that these sort of UNFCCC-based organizations not only look into the provision of financing, like you're saying, so it's, we move away from this issue of just receiving, but rather sort of taking ownership of the potential in one's own country, just like you say. And I think that is really critical. And I really, really like that element and thought around becoming less reliant on sort of the North, because of the potential that we have as Africans and in African countries is just absolutely immense. But that capacity just does need some support. So as far as I know that there are sort of initiatives that come along, particularly in project preparation phases, which help government sort of prepare projects and get them ready for receiving financing. And that involves sort of a lot of knowledge transfer and capacity building. But as far as I'm aware, I'm not sure how much that happens between sort of cross regions in Africa. So I think it's definitely something that needs to be looked into further. And I think that's quite an interesting concept you're raising, because it's not so much a financing mechanism, but it's rather like a knowledge exchange, capacity building mechanism. So I agree, it's absolutely super important. There are some instances of it currently. And yeah, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts around perhaps how this could become more African-based. That's all from me. I'm not sure how much I answered the question, but those are my thoughts. And just agreeing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Amy. It would also be nice to like hear if Usman has any thoughts about that as well. If you are thinking on your response, I just like to also pose a question to Esther in the meantime, and just want to hear what practical advice would you give to other countries who are seeking to strengthen the alignment as well?
Thank you so much, Nina, for the question. I also wanted to comment a little bit on what Usman had raised. He raised the issue of political will and also the issue of government inefficiencies. I think when it comes to increasing energy access in the country, or even implementing the various climate change legal frameworks, the political will has to be there. Because if there is no political will, then how will you it's actually not you'll struggle to implement those particular projects. Then also government inefficiencies. That one we may not have any control. No one may have control. The controls have to be set in within the government systems, so that if there is the issue of transparency, it is set within the system. If the issue of wastage of finances for climate change related projects, the system should actually be within. And of course, we know that the system, the checks and balances may be there, but the individual, the integrity of the individuals also matters. Then the practical advice I would give is that as African countries, let's take advantage of the abundant renewable energy resources that we have. Because, for example, the sun is abundant in Africa. It's free. Look at the issue of hydro. For those people who have high mountainous places with the rivers, take advantage of that resource that is given freely by nature. There's so much we can do as African countries, taking advantage of abundant resources, as long as financing, and we have been well advised by the presenter who presented on issues on finances. So let's take advantage of our resources, which are very abundant. Sometimes I look at countries in the north where they have long periods of winter, yet you find some with even trying to tap the little solar energy that comes. Then I ask myself, ourselves, we have the whole year, our solar energy is there. Can we be able to do something as African countries to tap what is ours, what is there naturally given? Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm on mute over there. Thank you. Yes, that's such powerful answer over there. It is what can we do with our available resources as well. I'm not sure if anyone would like to have any more questions or comments they'd like to provide. If not, then we'd just like to post a poll on your right now just to get your feedback on the webinar. Just take a few minutes. It is being shared right now. In the meantime, I'd just like to thank all our speakers and participants for the insightful discussion today on we've explored how sustainable SDG 7 can be aligned with NDCs under the Paris Agreement, and We are not only looking at policy frameworks, but as also real-world case studies and pathways of financing clean energy solutions. On behalf of the growing Government Energy and Access project funded by the UK Aid through the Transforming Energy Access Programme, we thank you for joining us. We encourage you to stay connected, continue the conversation, and apply what has been shared today. With that, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you at future sessions.